I'm Peter. I'm the English pastor at Brisbane Cantonese Christian Church. Reach Australia exists to see healthy, multiplying evangelistic churches across Australia among people of every tribe, language and tongue. You're listening to a special series on cultural differences and cultural issues among particularly the Asian Australian church. Joining me today, I've got Iggy Wong from Brisbane and Ying Yee from Sydney, and we're going to hear from him today. So let's just get underway.
Cool.
Ying, just tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? Where are you from? What do you do?
Okay. I am fully born in Sydney. I grew up in a little suburb called Artarmon. Did education in Sydney, went to a school called Croesus Boys High School. That became a girls' school when I left. It was taken over by North Sydney Girls. I went to New South Wales University, did engineering, went out, worked as a tax officer, went to ministry, got married, 3 lovely kids, and a female cat. So it's great.
What's the cat's name?
I'm a household of women, and I lose every argument.
What's the cat's name?
The cat's name is Jinx. My daughters gave that name. Pretty cool. So, every time I come home, where's my lovely cat? I've got to remember to say hello to my wife and my kids.
And what do you do? What are you doing at the moment?
That's a big question. Apart from flying on my flight simulator, I'm involved in ministry at the Chinese Christian Church at Milsons Point.
Yep.
And I've been doing that for 30 years.
Ying, I thought you said you'd been doing it longer.
I've been in the church for 50 years, but as a formal minister for 30 years. So you could say that I was a lay leader for 20 years, as a formal pastor for 30 years.
So what changed? How did you get into that?
How did I get into formal ministry? I got into formal ministry because when I was at New South Wales Uni, you could say my chaplain, Philip Jensen, challenged me to go into full-time ministry. And that was in second year uni, but it was the last year uni when he finally approached me and told me, Ying, you got to do MTS with me. And I said, that's a wonderful idea. Then I did what is known as the famous Jonah Bolt. The Jonah Bolt was, that means to say that God calls you that way. I did the 180. And so I went and worked in the tax office. But then realized that tax was not my thing. So eventually the whale got me. Not the whale, sorry. The big fish got me, so I went into ministry. That was a 4-year journey. Yeah.
So just help our audience here. What's your kind of context? What's your community? What's your church like?
Yeah. My church is the Chinese Christian Church. It's a Chinese church. The church is about 55 years old. It's a congregation, it's a population of about 600 to 700. Spread over, now how many congregations I have? 1, 2, 3, 4 in the morning, 1 in the evening, 6 congregations. Wow. Is that right? I think that's right. A youth ministry and a Sunday school. I think I'm getting old.
We'll take your word for it.
Okay, yeah, something like that. And so there are 3 English congregations, and so I take care of those 3 English congregations. But I've been doing that for the last 3 years on my own, but by God's grace, I've got 3 extra staff to help me run the English ministries and the youth ministry, which is fantastic.
And just in terms of the makeup, what's kind of the cultural, ethnic makeup of your church?
Very diverse. It's, diverse within Asian context. We have basically Mandarin, Cantonese, and English. So the Mandarin's interesting because it consists of, once it used to be just Taiwanese, now it's mainland Chinese and Taiwanese. Cantonese is, predominantly, all of them from Hong Kong. And the English, a lot of them in the modern congregation come from Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, Singapore. A lot of them are actually born in Australia. And but it's interesting also in my 11-15 congregation, we're getting a little more diversity of non-Asian. So at the moment, I'm doing a Bible study with an Aussie, true blue Aussie, a Filipino, a Macedonian. And there was one time when we had a guy from the Ruhr, another guy who was from India, and something like that. So one guy once said that this congregation's too white for him. Okay. Fair enough.
So I'm curious because your church is called Chinese Christian
Yeah.
Church, Milsons Point. How do those guys come into the church?
Well,
What gets them through the door?
Guess. Missionary dating. In other words, they have Christian girls who actually decide to go and hang out with these non-Christian boys. And they come in. And guess what? Most of them became Christians.
Yeah, wow.
So this Bible study that I'm running with this Filipino, this Macedonian, actually he's not a Macedonian, he's Maltese, actually Maltese, sorry. And this sort of true blue Aussie, they were all brought in because they were interested in the girls in our church. And they all got converted. And now I'm just training them I'm taking them through basic Christianity studies. I just trained them 2 ways to live. I'm saying to them, let's go through so many questions and how to do apologetics. It's just totally awesome.
God's grace, but you wouldn't recommend that as a strategy to Northern
I would
Point?
not recommend it, but
Okay,
it's working.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, that's right. I won't recommend it, but it does work. But it's not our accepted strategy, or is it policy? God just uses whatever.
Now, that's a long time that you've been there.
Yep.
What are some of the, in broad kind of brushstrokes, what are kind of some of the changes, trends that you've kind of seen as in your time there? Like,
what are some of the changes and trends within the Chinese community or my church?
let's start with church and then move to the community.
Okay, my church, I suppose when the church started, it was a very traditional Chinese church. And you got the young guys like myself coming in, and we basically have the aunties and uncles, and we basically, just do what they tell us. But over the years, you could say that as we find the rise of the second generation, they've become much more open. The older congregation, the other congregations have become much more open to new ideas. That's the first thing. I think that's the biggest change. I think you could say that having stuck out there for so many years and being the one who, in the Batman language, rattles the cage, you could say that finally the cage is sort of broken down and now big some changes. I think the second thing that I've seen change is big changeover in staff, and that's changed a lot of things. I think it's interesting, and I wouldn't have expected this, but in more recent years, there's been a lot more openness to reaching beyond the Chinese within my church. So interesting. And certainly, I was surprised by that. Even our Mandarin pastor was thinking that we need to actually be more open to reaching beyond the Chinese if we're going to get the next generation. So that's pretty cool. Yeah.
Ian, can I pick up something you said there? So you mentioned quite a big turnover in staff over the years at CCC. Would you say that working in a Chinese church, well, from your experience, that it's been a challenging context to work in? And
it has been a very challenging context. So a lot of the people, a lot of staff have moved on, sadly, because of they just could not cope with the context. The staff, the structures, the politics and things like that.
Yeah. Can you speak into some of those? Like without you don't have to go into too many specifics, but just to help people understand what are some of the unique things that often come with Chinese churches. It may be unique to CCC, but there may be some things that
I think if I might speak into, say, like the second gen, right, and this is my context, a lot of the second gen don't get it when they come to work in Chinese church. And it took me, you could say, 40 years to realize that. 40 years. That's why I'm a slow learner. But, they come in with this sort of context, I want to change the world. They want to come in with the context, let's have a dialogue with all the different leadership structures and something like that. But they don't realize it's actually tough because many of the second gen are brought up in a Western context where everyone's sort of like an equal part. Let's just have a dialogue and talk through that sort of thing. It doesn't work that way in the Chinese church. And so many of them struggle with that sort of thing. I think the second thing is that many of our second gen pastors, and myself included, our ministry formation was out of a university context. And a university context is a very sort of fast move, very focused, very sort of single-minded type of ministry. When they come into a Chinese church, not only do you have to deal with the cultural issues, you do Also, then you've got to deal with the speed at which churches move, which is actually slow. That's a challenge. And that took a long time. And I think a lot of times struggle with that. They struggle also with the idea, not in the Chinese, but there are personalities. There's certain people that really just, grates against the grain, so to speak. And I think a lot of them just found it difficult coping with not only the cultural issues, the slowness of which churches change, but also the personality types. I think one thing we've come to realize over many years is that when you work in a team, it's just not giftedness that counts, it's also chemistry. And I think you could say that in our church, we placed a lot of emphasis on giftedness, but didn't give enough emphasis on chemistry. And I think you could say that the people who we basically brought on board, they were certainly gifted people, but they didn't have the chemistry to make it work for the whole team. Yeah, so that was difficult.
So, if there's second gen people who are in ministry or thinking about ministry, what are some things that you would want them to be thinking about then as they consider that?
That's a good question. And that's something I've been thinking about for years. And I think the big thing I would say to them is think like a cross-cultural missionary. That's the big thing. Because you think like a cross-cultural missionary, what are you going to do? You learn the language, you build relations, you take your time, right? And the funny thing is, that's what you need to think like when you work in a church. You got to learn the language, you got to understand, build relationships, and take your time. Now, it's a funny thing because I didn't realize that. When I went back to my home church, I thought we were all on the same page because we all speak English. Yeah. But then I realized that though people can speak the same language, their culture actually, you could say their culture brings a different context into those words. I didn't realize that. It took me 10 years to realize that. And then, I'm thinking of coming in there and position things, and I'm here, I'm the pastor. Just do what I tell you. But I realized that, no, you've actually got to build relationships right across the board, right? And then you've got to understand the culture. That's the challenge itself. It's a very different culture, right? And then you've got to also take your time. I was talking to a young guy there at not in my church, but in another church. So I caught up with him. He's a young guy, started in the Chinese church. When he started, he was excited about working in the Chinese church. It was 6 months. I said, oh, cool. He was very excited. Well, I met up with him 2 years. I decided to ask him 2 years later. So how's it coming along? Oh man, he wanted to leave. What? I said, why? Because it's so slow. And I said, how long do you think it was going to take to change the world? He said, 2 years. Right? I said, come on, get over it. You think about it. You're a young kid. I didn't say it that way. I'm trying to be his friend. But in my mind, you're a young kid and you're talking to the elders of this church who've probably planted this church and been in this ministry for 30, 40 years, and you want to change everything in 2 years. Get real. I was much politer then. I was putting on my pastor hat. Oh, yeah, I understand you. But, he understood it.
It's funny that you say that coming off the mission field myself, you go to a mission field and you're like, I'm in a different country, I'm in a different place. I got to learn the language, I got to learn the culture.
Yep.
And, they train you for that, they prepare you for that. And so you do that. Yeah. But coming back, I kind of left that all behind. And I'm finding myself in that same position now where I'm like, I got to think like a missionary.
Exactly.
I got to learn the language, I got to learn the culture, I got to learn the history.
Yep.
And that kind of brings me to how do you, a lot of Chinese churches, and particularly just the Chinese culture, they value history.
Yep.
How do you honor that history? How do you, as part of learning that culture, how do you honor the history?
Well, it's simple. The way you honor the history is by studying history. And the problem with many people is that they don't study the history of the church, right? You don't actually try and understand, why are you doing this? Why do you do that? Why do you say it that way? And so a lot of times when we come in with a superficial understanding. We listen to their words. We don't actually understand what's going on. You go to a meeting, it doesn't work the way you run it. You want to run it, and then you complain, but you haven't understood why it runs that way. And so the way you honor history is by studying history. Then you know what to do. And so the problem for most people who come into any sort of context is that they're gung-ho like I was. You want to change the world like I did, and I still want to do that, but you don't want to give it the time to do your research. That's why I've said to this young guy, one thing I say to people who start ministry, the first thing you need to do is get out there and talk to all sorts of people, not just so that you can build relationships, so you can understand what's going on, understand why they think like that, understand why they say things like that, understand why they do things like that. And then when you've done that, then you go away and do the analysis and say, okay, what do I make of all that? How do I then shape a ministry that gives respect to all this, but yet at the same time moves things forward? And that takes time. So you could say I'm a very slow learner because it took me 40 years to realize the history of this church. That's why that's why. I'm slow.
That's okay.
The Lord gives me more time, so I'll pick up the pace.
So for those of us who are starting out on that journey or, in a new place, just to give some, hopefully, encouragement, what kind of time are we looking at? It's not a fixed number, but what do people need to understand about time and what it takes for that work to
That's
pay
a good
off?
question. I think the time it takes depends on which generation you're coming in as, right? I've always said it takes 3 generations to see big changes. The first generations are the ones who get crucified and see no change. The second generation gets flogged and might see small changes. And it's the third generation that gets that sees all the fun. And so the problem is, if you come in as the first generation, you will never see any change. You're the ones that got crucified. Everyone smashed you and you just leave. But you might have actually rattled the cage enough. The second generation comes in, the cage has been rattled. They still don't like you because you're making changes, but you've probably rattled them enough that when you leave, okay, the third generation says, hey, let's learn some lessons from the previous. And then the third one comes in. What was the problem with this? This is awesome.
So you've been around long enough that you've been there for how many generations?
Yeah, you could say that I'm the one who's seen through the first, second, and third generation. You've got to be there long enough. So like the guys who are coming in now, you could say they're the third generation because, basically people like myself have done all the battles and all the hard yards for them. And so they're coming in on a cruise liner.
So Ying, you're still there after all that time, and you talked about those generations with people leaving the church, but you've stuck through there. Yeah. Can you tell us what has helped you to actually persevere through the challenges?
What's helped me?
Yeah. Besides God's grace, obviously.
Yeah. Well, I actually would say that, firstly, I would go back, God's grace, because I know that when I went to Bible college, I had made a covenant before God never to go back to the Chinese church. But then someone convinced me to go back, and my little prayer to God was, give me this grace to endure. That was nearly 30 years ago, and he's actually fulfilled that prayer. But that aside, what's actually helped me to endure? I think there are a few things. One, remember what Jesus says, that even when one sinner repents, there's more rejoicing in heaven. And so what gives me great joy is the fact that there's always one person repenting. In the midst of that, you get all the muck and all the sort of crap that goes on in churches. I always find there's one person repenting, and that always gives you joy in the midst of difficulty. I think the second thing is to be realistic and say, this is ministry. What do you expect? It's like someone going to war and thinks they're going to play tennis every day. That's crazy. It's like joining the SAS and say, let's go and play beach volleyball. Half the reason why people don't survive is they have unrealistic expectations. When you get smashed and people accuse you unjustly and unfairly, that's just the life. When you realize that that's it, that helps you to manage it, right? I think the third thing that's given me strength to endure is realizing that whatever roadblock God puts in your way, it's opportunity to think differently. And so I've said that my church has been one of the greatest instruments for thinking creatively. I still remember the best time in my life was after my first contract expired. I said to the elders at the time, then they asked me, what do you want to do? Now, they're expecting that I would say the nice pastoral thing. I want to go and visit people and care for them and comfort them and weep with them. They're nice things. But, being young and arrogant, I say, I just want to challenge every young person, give it that job and go to ministry. Now, that's not something you say to an elder, right? Well, they actually tried to get rid of me, right? They took the congregation away from me. They wouldn't let me preach. They put me on probation for 1 year and things like that. And they suspended my ordination for the next 10 years, right? One second. But that was the best time in my life because I had nothing to do and I didn't want to sit around on my bum doing nothing. So I started thinking, well, let's grab a group of guys and start training. And out of that became all the sorts of ministries that I started over the last year. So what I've learned from that is that when the church puts up a lot of roadblocks, that's not a problem. That's an opportunity to think outside the box, right? And one person said to me a few years ago, Ying, why don't you leave your church because you could do so much more outside? And I pondered on that thing. The funny thing about that is I've done more than I have ever imagined I could ever do from the confines of my church. Why would I ever leave that? I've had the opportunity to start conferences, as you know, Iggy and Peter, in Brisbane, in Melbourne, in Southwest Sydney, overseas. I've had an opportunity to speak into the lives of people all around Australia and New Zealand. And that's also because of the experience I had at CCC. And so how can I give that up? So let me just say one thing. Out of that, I came up with one philosophy. I told a friend down in Melbourne, which I think he took offense to, but it doesn't matter. Ministry is about learning how to survive and thrive and change the world from a cage, right? I think I've said that to you, Iggy. Have I ever said that to you?
I don't think so, but I like it.
It's about surviving and thriving and change the world from a cage. And why is that? Because ministry always takes place in a cage. And the problem I find with most people is they spend all their ministry life trying to get out of one cage, discover there's another cage and another cage, and they go to glory and God says, what did you do with your life? Trying to get out of cages. Why'd you waste your time? You could have changed the world from your cage, except you wanted to spend time unlocking cage. And I got that idea from Paul. Because remember what Paul says? What happened to me in jail is actually further work of the gospel. He didn't worry about trying to get out. He's just excited because what's happened to him is actually further work of the gospel.
So let's take this forward a few steps. We've kind of painted some challenges that we face in ministry, particularly in the Chinese church context. But what's the vision? What motivation do we have to keep going, to persevere, and to just keep running that race?
In the Chinese churches?
In Chinese churches, in ministry, what is it that keeps us going for the long haul?
I think what keeps us going is that Jesus loves his church. See, people ask me, why do I love the church? Because Jesus loves the church. If he loves the church, why should I abandon her? No matter how crappy the church is, Jesus died for that church. His spirit is in that church. His word continues to be preached. Maybe sometimes not the best, but it's still his bride. How can I give up on the bride? You tell me that. Doesn't matter how big or small it is, that's the bride of Jesus, and I got to love that bride. And God, in his graciousness, has asked me to help do the makeup for that bride. That's pretty cool. Now, I'm not a great makeup artist, but, it's okay. I'm all right, I can do it. Yeah. So that's why, And the great thing that gives me joy is I know that one day Jesus is going to complete the work on these people, regardless. Yeah. So, it's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So I'm in a job where I'm going to always win.
That's good. That's a good thing about ministry, isn't it?
It is. It's awesome.
On God's side.
Yeah. 50 years, I'm still excited about my church.
Yeah.
That's great. Let's kind of just break some of that down a little bit.
Sure.
What are some of the specific things that you've seen that need addressing or just being mindful of in the Chinese church context that may not be an issue elsewhere in the Australian context?
What are some of the specific issues? Oh, that may not. That's the problem. I was thinking through this one. And to be honest, I'm not sure. I've been rattling this question for years and I'm not sure. Because to a large degree, here's the thing, right? There are three elements when I look at the Chinese church. Spiritually, they need the gospel like every other church. Humanly, they need relationships like every other church, right? And so they need that sort of thing. Culturally, I think there are particularly unique cultural issues, I might say that, which I think they are not different, they're different, but not worse. So take, for instance, the Chinese church. They value family, but the danger of Chinese church is they idolize family life. They idolize it. Whereas in the West, we don't value it enough. We idolize individualism. And so you've got to actually say in the Chinese church, love your family, but don't worship them. All right? In the Western context, like I said, we value the individual, but we idolize it. I've got to say to the people in Chinese church, to the young ones, you're actually an adult. You can actually think for yourself. It's okay to actually say no to your parents. Now, how you say that's another thing, right? You can actually make your own decisions, right? When I speak to them about premarital counseling, remember to love your in-laws, but keep them at a distance, In the Western context, we value the egalitarian, not the egalitarian in the sense that we're all equal, which is a great thing, but we don't respect authority enough. That was my problem. But in the Chinese church, we respect authority too much, that we don't give enough weight to the young people to give them an equal voice. So I suppose when you talk about what are the distinctive, I've probably got to compare that and contrast that with the West. You can't take that in isolation. And I think that was my problem. We think about, again, missionary context, right? My biggest problem, I came into my church unconsciously with a very Western mindset. Not necessarily a Christian mindset, but a Western mindset, which I had to undo and those sorts of things.
So in your years then at church, how have you had those conversations? How have you navigated through that while you're learning, but also trying to speak into some of those with your church?
Oh, look, I'm a slow learner. I am a slow learner. And I can tell you in theory, but I tell you what, I should not do this, but my wife says to me, I should not do this, and I still do it, right? I can tell the young guys don't do it, but, I'm just a stubborn person that I don't like being told what to do. I don't like following process. Do you realize in the whole 50 years, I've never called anyone auntie or uncle? Now, that is culturally insensitive.
That is...
Wow.
I'm processing that.
Yeah, that is so bad.
You sure you're in the Chinese church?
Yeah, I'm in the Chinese. Okay. I've never called anyone uncle or auntie. I just can't get over it. So how have I navigated through? I can say with you with great pain and with great foolishness, and I'm still working on it, okay?
God's grace, once again.
God's grace. But I think the other thing is that, but because I've built relationships, people know me. Let me give you a funny incident in my church, and I think this highlights. A few years ago, I was my renewal for being a pastor was up for renewal, right? And so we vote in the AGM to renew our pastors, right? Now, one person gets up there and says to the whole congregation, "Before you vote, I need to say something about Ying. There's something you don't know about him." Oh, and everyone's looking around. What's he done? Committed adultery. And he says, he is stubborn and doesn't follow procedures. And everyone knew that. They say, what's new? And then they just voted me in. So that highlights that despite all my failures, my relational capital has been big enough to carry me through that sort of thing. And so that's why it's important to build relationships, because as you build relationships, then people will give you leniency for your stupidity. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Ying, if we can change tack a little bit.
Sure.
In terms of something you mentioned before, was that one thing that keeps you going is rejoicing when sinners repent, come to the Lord. I think that keeps us all going.
That's right.
Gives us that joy. Can you speak a little bit into evangelism in your context? maybe some of the unique challenges you found as you're reaching, migrants as well as Aussie-born Chinese, the different demographics that are in your church. What are some things that you've learned about evangelism into that context?
Yeah, I think, look, there's a lot of things I could say about that. So let me just rattle them off, okay? This is what I've observed. Firstly, the first thing about evangelism is that people need to learn how to talk. Now, what do I mean by that? One thing I learned when I was at University of New South Wales, and two I used to live, is that evangelism takes place naturally in the context of conversation. Here's the funny thing. Most people in my church don't know how to have a conversation. They're introverts. They're shy. They'll talk to their close friends, but they don't know how to have conversations with people. So the first thing I have to teach people to do is how to have conversations. They don't even do it at church. They're amongst their friends. But when a newcomer comes in, they don't want to be rude, but they don't know what to say, so they just go and hang out with their friends. So the first thing I've got to teach people is how to just have a conversation, right? And that's the first thing. I think the second thing I've realized, and this comes back to an earlier point, how things have changed. There was once a time when church used to be the center of, the whole thing. When I was at church many years ago, there was nothing else on Sunday, so people would come to church, right? It doesn't happen anymore. It's no use thinking about how to bring people to church. You've got to empower them to go and just talk to their people. So here's the second thing I'd say to people. Just build, whatever you do, invite your non-Christian friends to whatever event you're doing, right? If you're going to hang out go to a barbecue to church friends, think about non-Christian friends you can invite to, right? If you want to go to the movies, invite non-Christian friends. If you're going to go to the beach, invite non-Christian. Build that relationship with that sort of thing. I think the third thing that I've learned, and this has been very helpful, and this is something I've never forgotten, that comes out of at the end of the 2 Ways to Live training, and that's the idea of God talk. As Philip very powerfully reminded us, it's sometimes the most important thing about turning conversation to the gospel is the conversation is what you've got to say rather than trying to get them to speak. And so the big thing I've got to teach people is just how to introduce God in small, quiet ways that lead to the gospel. So God talk that might lead to gospel talk, and getting them to do that sort of thing. So 1, get them to talk. 2, find context where you just bring them naturally, just talk, just naturally. And thirdly, get them to learn how to do God talk. Because if they don't even know how to God talk, they're not going to do gospel talk. And that's what I've been trying to do. So the thing that I think we've moved away from the big rallies, and I think now it's about empowering people just to go and just talk to their friends and so on. I had one dear guy this is my common illustration. I love the guy named Jim, who went at my bilingual service. So he's a guy I mentored, a disciple. And I got him to start a bus driver's ministry, right? But one thing I had to teach him is how to speak in the colloquial language. So as we go through 2 Ways to Live, okay, here's the language of the Bible. Here's the language. I want you to go and talk to your friends, your non-Christian friends, and I want you to work out try and translate these words into language that they can understand. He comes back to me and says, that's difficult. I know it's difficult, but you've got to learn to do that. If we're going to speak into the lives of these people, we've got to learn to speak their language and that sort of thing. So that's probably the fourth thing I say. And the only way you're going to do that is by talking. The more you talk to them, the more you understand the sort of language that you've got to say. So when you talk about evangelism, I think my thinking, the problem is not the evangelism itself. The problem these days is I can't even get them to the starting block. Because for these things, I've just got to get to the starting block. If I can get to the starting block, then okay.
Yeah. The last point you're talking about, that the bus drivers ministry and stuff, and I think it's thinking hard about the context you're speaking to, the cultural considerations, I guess, of the bus driver culture in one sense. I guess for those who are not from the Asian culture, as we do evangelism, are there unique aspects to consider that maybe you might take for granted as an Asian, but maybe for an Anglo-Aussie, they might not understand in terms of seeking to evangelize the Asian community around them?
Oh, what, to the Anglos speaking to the Asians? I think, what can I say? I think a lot of those sorts of things I said, but I think one thing that's probably helpful is that when you're trying to evangelize Asians, you've got to think about in terms of communities, not just individuals, right? Asians are so wedded to their family, because that's how they think, that you've got to not only speak to the individual, but you've got to think about how to engage the whole family as well. That's a very important thing. Very important thing. And so building relationships with the parents and something like that. Here's the second thing. When you're trying to evangelize even to the Asians, right? Whether you like or not, the Asians also have a very, the young people have a great love for their parents, for better or for worse, right? And so, which is one reason why I'm in Chinese church. If I want to reach the second gen, guess what? I always ask them and I always talk to the second gen, what can we do to reach your parents? Mandarin or Cantonese speaking, what can we do to reach them? And, when I ask that question, their eyes light up because they are concerned about reaching their parents, but they don't know what to do. So I'm always asking, what can we do to reach your parents? And that's when I've got to bring the Mandarin and Cantonese involved because I can't do it, right? So always, when you evangelize them, always keep thinking in terms of the family dynamics. It plays a very important part, even more so than, say, in the Western context, I would say.
That's helpful.
Any other questions?
You've trained and sent out a number of people into the ministry from your context. How did that start? What were some of the obstacles along the way?
As I meet lots of people in ministry who are Chinese in Sydney, for example, a lot of them went through CCC. I'm actually finding. There's a huge amount of ministers that went through CCC. Yeah. So I guess we're curious about that. Is it something that in the CCC culture was that something?
Yeah, I don't know what's in the CCC culture. It's something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah.
And I think the way it's very simple. My thinking is I'm very big on empowering people, right? Mobilizing people, right? I want to empower people to do the ministry which God has called them to, whatever that might be, right? But one of those ministries is also full-time ministry, right? And so when I'm watching people, I'm watching about what they could do, what they are doing, and what they could do. And so when I work out what they could do, then I just continue to meet with them and start exploring it. So let me give you an example, right? There was a young kid about 10 years ago. He was giving an announcement at the church about the youth ministry. He was about year 10 at the time, right? I watched him do that announcement and said, mate, this guy's awesome. Absolutely awesome. So I said to the youth leader, okay, we need to give this guy an opportunity to preach. And so I got him the opportunity to preach later on, but he's one of our best preachers out. I have been talking about full-time ministry over the thing, but it's now about whether he's willing to actually do that sort of thing. So what I tend to do is I tend to look for people. I always got my eyes out looking for people. When I see them, I start talking to them, seeding ideas. I start meeting with them. And it's a journey that we've got to go through over many years. But, it's something that I'm intentional, very focused on. And so even now, I just shot an email to my other colleagues, my English pastors. These are the guys that we've got to keep an eye on. Let's think of what we're going to do with these guys.
You bring up an interesting point there. A lot of, I guess, Asian people tend to be more shy, more introverted, less outspoken, less initiative. Yeah. What do you look for? What are you looking for when you're trying to identify those people? If they're not people who are necessarily taking initiative and, I guess, in a way stand out, obviously, what is it that you're seeing? What is it that you're looking for? Yeah, well, there's a lot of people who won't take initiative, but there are some. Those who I want to see going to full-time ministry are the ones who do take initiative. They're the ones who take initiative to gather people around them. They're just natural. They start thinking about ideas. Here's something I'm thinking about, right? What do you think? And then they start putting putting ideas into action and say, that's great. So let me give you an example of one youth leader. I was the youth pastor. A guy fronts up to me, do you need any hand and help? Right? He was the youth leader. I said, sure.
And so I watched him. Boy, this guy began to take leadership, and I just handed over him. I was just saying to him, I think you need to go in full-time ministry, right? So not everyone will take initiative, but I tell you what, there are always going to be some people who do take initiative, and those are the guys I keep my eyes on constantly.
And what about leaders in your church, whether they're elders or deacons? Yeah. Maybe not full-time ministry, but when you're looking for those people, what are you looking for? I look for similar qualities, but I also know that people going to full-time ministry need an extra quality, and that they either have not only leadership skill, but they're skilled to be able to teach the Word of God, and they have much higher people skills, right? Many of the people going to leadership may not be great in teaching, may not be super great with people, but they can cross the line. They're the people I would challenge to become elders. Because why is that? Because I tell you what, one thing I've worked out is that for a person to survive in full-time ministry, they need good, strong lay leaders working in partnership with them. So these days, if they're not going to full-time ministry, I'm thinking, would you go and become an elder or a deacon? And so there's one guy that I've been mentoring for about 5 years. Now, I had initially thought about him going to full-time ministry, so I was meeting up with him. But the more I got to know him, I said, no, probably not. I think he will destroy the church, right? But I think he would be a great elder. And so I've been mentoring and discipling him, making sure he becomes one of our great elders so that the next generation of pastors and him would work well as an awesome team. Yeah.
Do you think there's any unique challenges in the Asian context, especially with the high place of family and the expectations there of people taking that step into full-time ministry? As over the years, how have you helped people navigate, I guess, that tension of, their family expectations?
Yeah.
Providing for their family. It's a very big part of Asian culture. And actually, that view of ministry as not, I guess, a high status profession, which will provide well, in one sense. Yeah. How have you helped people navigate?
Yeah, that? I don't think there is an easy way to navigate through that because I had to go through it myself. So when I told my parents I want to go full-time ministry, it just broke their heart completely. They were angry, they were upset, but I had to go through that. And I think these days there are some people who I think will have to go through that same trial themselves, right? But I think and I don't know there's any easy way. Some people, they come in a Christian family, and I think our church has come to a stage where they're very supportive of the young people going to ministry, right? There are some young people who come from non-Christian backgrounds who have to go through a difficult period. But I think the advantage that they have now, unlike past, is at least they've got a church which is much, much more supportive. I'll be there for them and stuff like that. I think when I had to go through that difficult, I don't think anyone at church understood the difficult I had to go through. People outside the church were helping me, but they didn't understand the Chinese context and stuff like that. But I think our church is a much better place to actually support them. It won't be easy; it'll be still difficult. But I think we've got to say to the young people, this is where it comes back to saying that they value family, which is right, but they've got to actually remember that Jesus says, "You want to love me, you got to love me over and above your parents." And that's a hard word. I have said that even to some of our young people of late, that you've got to think through this hard question.
How have you worked through that with your leadership? To get to a point now where the church is supportive, on board? Are there conversations you've had? Are there things that you've done to help in that process?
I think it's just a maturing over the years of the priority of gospel ministry. It has not. I remember when I first started this sort of journey, 20 years ago. When I was challenging young people to think about full-time ministry, you get hit and you get hit. Some people think that you're playing God, or some parents are saying that you're teaching young people to be lazy, and so. But I think it's much more different now. But that's been a conversation and a journey of many, many years. It was not overnight. Yeah. So it's a lot more. We're a lot more open to it now, which is great.
Yeah. So it's imbibing that ministry culture and culture change takes a long time, doesn't it?
That's right.
Yeah.
And I think that you're right. I think it's not the conversation, it's the culture change that takes place, and that culture change has been constantly just seeding over the years, over the many years, and you get pushback. So I'll give you an example, like I tried to introduce something like the apprenticeship program like MTS. That took me 10 years to get to the starting block, just 10 years, just to the starting block.
I think I remember when you're starting it.
Yeah?
Yeah. Back in the day.
Oh, wow, a long time. 10 years.
So in the Australian context, we have an Australian church.
Yep.
What is the place of the Chinese church? I mean, you've got churches nearby to you, strong evangelical churches. Why have a Chinese church? And, how do you relate to those churches?
Yeah, it's a good question. Many years ago, I was speaking at my friend's church, and I was preaching on the Great Commission, right? The Gospels for all nations. And I said to them, it's because I believe the Gospels for all nations, which is why I believe in Chinese churches. Why is that? Because they're the best people to reach the Chinese, right? They're the best people. They have the relationships, they have the looks, they have the sort of cultural ability, they have the connections. And so it seems strange that we don't play to our strength, right? Now, I could very easily work in an Anglo church, right? I did my internship or student ministry in a sort of an Anglican church, and I did it quite good. I can work in that space quite easily. But when I came back to my church, there are things I could do there much more than I could do not in an Anglican church, right? So I say so. Why Chinese churches? I think because we're a better place to reach the Chinese. And even more so, like I said, the second gen, if I'm reaching the second gen, I cannot ignore reaching their parents. I've got to reach their parents, right? We started a branch church many years ago, and it was a lovely little community church at Lane Cove, and they invited me to be their pastor. They were going to go independent. They want to be a community church. And I said to them, I would love to, but I can't. Because who would reach my parents? I will not be able to bring my parents to this church. That's why I need to be in my church. Because my father passed away, unbelievable, which is sad. My mum's in a nursing home, so... But, there was a moment a few weeks ago that I asked our Cantonese pastor, can you translate a short devotion that I can give to my mother in Cantonese, right? And I played it to my mother. And the same for my in-laws. We bring them to Chinese New Year, where it's all Cantonese or Mandarin. And in fact, when my dad was alive, I invited them to Chinese New Year festival at my church, and all the aunties and uncles, there's the only time I say it, all the aunties and uncles, they were very friendly to my parents, and they speak in the Chinese and stuff like that. So that's why, right? As long as we have Chinese first, second gen, there's always going to be a need for Chinese churches. Now, how do I relate them to the Aussie churches? We pray for them. But they have their space that they need to work in. That's fine. So, and we have our space. So, Church by the Bridge, North Sydney, St Thomas's, North Sydney. I value their ministry. I haven't done anything with them, not because we're against them, but because we're busy with what our neck of the woods in terms of reaching Chinese. They're busy with that sort of thing. So that's cool. I mean, I've said to them, I haven't said to them, I thought, look, why aren't we a community church? Why aren't we reaching the local community? Because you know what? Church by the Bridge could do it better than we can. So why don't we want to play in that space? Let's play in the space that they can't play in, and that is reaching the Chinese.
So what's the future then? First generation is eventually going to pass away.
Yep.
What's the future then? Do you move away from that when you get the third, fourth generation? Does the Chinese church no longer have a place?
Good question. There is a church that I've been ministering to for many years. I was involved in that church up in the southwest. They are a Timorese church, a lovely church, Timorese. Timorese migration to Australia almost, I'm not even sure, pretty low. They have no future if they're going to insist on being a Timorese church. So they've changed them to becoming a local community church. And I think that's right, because there aren't that many more Timorese. And I think the Chinese churches will be here as long as the migration from China or Hong Kong or Southeast Asia is still there. When that dries up completely, then the Chinese churches use by date will be not far. But until such a time, it's still going to be with us. And the second thing I'd say to that is that I think the Chinese churches, and I think also particularly many Asian churches, usually have the sweet spot into the first, second, and the third generation. That's their sweet spot. Beyond that, I probably don't think that they should come to the Chinese church. Beyond that.
Why?
Now, this is my theory. It has not been tested, but I think I'm right, okay? Because I'm an arrogant Chinese guy, right? I think it's because of language and relationship. Second gen will generally still speak to their parents in Chinese and to their grandparents. As long as that relationship's still there between the parents and the kids and the grandkids, I think they'll still be in a Chinese church. That's because they are still wedded to the Chinese culture. But once the parents, they move beyond that and their parents start becoming more, like they stop learning how to speak Chinese and they speak English at home, and the parents start building relationships with neighbors, like whatever, then you find that their sense of having to be in a Chinese church begins to diminish significantly. So my daughters, I suspect that they will probably still be in a Chinese church. If I have grandchildren, probably not.
Ying, you mentioned to me before that you were considering a building project at CCC.
That's right. Considering.
Are you allowed to say how much that project is? You don't have to. It's okay.
Lots of money. We're only considering. It's only a feasibility.
Anyway, but it did get me thinking. So the building project aside, it got me thinking about money in the Chinese church and how people view money, generosity, giving, things like that, and whether it's a topic you can even talk about in Chinese church. How have you found that over the years?
That's a good. It's very difficult talking about money from the pulpit because it just doesn't seem like the right thing. I know there are differences of opinion, and I respect that in the sort of a pastoral team. Some people feel that it's not right for the pastors to talk about money. More those from, say, like myself, a Western context growing up, we don't have a problem, but we understand that sensitivity. And I think there's probably it's a perception or ideas or theological thinking. And again, I want to honor and respect that. Some people feel like we just got to have faith in God, and you just ask people to be generous because what the Bible tells us, right? And that's about it. You don't ask, let's think about how to raise this amount of money, blah, 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 blah. Because they don't think that's the right thing. They have no hesitation to put a call out. So I'll give you an example. If you remember, there was the tsunami Boxing Day tragedy, right? So we put a call out for people to give, and within a week, the church gave 100,000 out of the congregation, and then the church just doubled that, right? I remember also that there was the call for Amity Press, which is a printing press in China. And again, the church, a lot of people just generally gave 100,000 or whatever within a week, and the church also subsidised that. So when there's very specific, clear projects, people are happy to give. I've worked out. But when it comes to general giving, I think a lot of people are very coy in saying that we want you to give more. Maybe that's because they don't have there's no clear project of what we want to do. Maybe that's the problem there.
We need to wrap this up, but any final thoughts just on stuff that we've been talking about? Any final thoughts you want to just throw out there?
Well, ministry is about learning to survive and thrive and change the world from a cage. So stop worrying about the cage, just change the world from a cage and do some awesome things.
Thank you, Ying.
That's cool.
Appreciate your wisdom.
No problem.
Well, I've been joined by Ying and Iggy today. This is a special season of the Reach Australia podcast. It's been great having you with us. Keep an eye out on future episodes as we continue to tackle some of these issues, and we look forward to having you with us again soon.